We're going to talk, kind of deep into the Stone Age culture. As we were already saying, understanding this thought to be prehistoric history is a problem for, it's a problem for us, but it's also a problem for the evolutionists as well. A lot of popular television programs like to make us think that these things are very tightly knit together and there are no problems with it. But both sides of the debate have their problems. We've discussed some of the problems on our side. Now that we're going to kind of give an overview of the evolutionary picture of things, and then we're going to talk about how we might be able to solve some of these issues. Now, for Bible believers, we really have two options. We can either accept these apparent long ages and try to squeeze them into the text, what we've already discussed. And many Christians have tried to do so. Or we can, on the other side, try to figure out how they work together. When it comes to the Stone Age history, some of that goes archaeological age dating of 1.5 million years ago. Obviously, we've got a major problem for biblical chronology. One that doesn't even, it's not even solved if we are able to stretch out 1,000 more years in the biblical chronology. So we need to try to figure out some of this fun, junky stuff. I really should begin with an overview, a review of the early hominids, but I'm not going to do that. If you go to Answers in Genesis website, answersingenesis.org, you'll be able to find a lot of great stuff on the early hominids. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off with the Stone Age cultures. The early hominids are people, creatures, whatever you want to call them, like the Australopithecines and all the Australio funny names like that. There's question as to whether these are human, non-human, or whatever, and I think we're not going to be able to figure that out unless the Doctor lets us borrow the TARDIS and we end up going back and we can solve that. But right now it's not happening because he's too busy saving the world. So thank you for those laughs. Now, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to kind of discuss the Stone Age cultures. We're going to start off talking about the Paleolithic. The Paleolithic age, lithic meaning stone. The Paleolithic age is split up into three different groups because archaeologists like to split things into three. The lower, the middle, and then the upper Paleolithic. The lower Paleolithic, according to evolutionary thinking, begins at 1.5 million years ago. Extends from 1.5 million to 250,000 years before present. It's defined by a lithic tradition known as the Acheulean. The Acheulean culture. And these are generally characterized by a hand axe. These are the guys who have the little hand axes. By the time we reach the late Acheulean period, we have cultural achievements that include things like making wooden spears, lance tips hardened by fire, the use of fire in food preparation, and they basically lived off of hunting and gathering, according to Jonker, Randall Jonker over at Andrews University. Again, this is the overview of the evolutionary type concept. When we reach the middle Paleolithic, by the time we get to 100,000 years before present, the key here is this industry called the Mousterian industry. And it includes things like stone points, scrapers, blades. And you can see the evolutionary progression of things as we continue. We also find things like bone tools. We find crude art, jewelry. And it's here that we begin to see the earliest definite traces of human burial practices. Finally, people are burying the dead. According to Jonker, the Middle Paleolithic climate is characterized, at least in the Middle East, by an increasing aridity from a warm interglacial to a final glacial period. We reach the Upper Paleolithic finally at 45,000 years before present to 10,000 years before present. Whereas in the earlier periods we find things like Homo erectus, archaic Homo sapien, Homo sapien neanderthalensis, and all the other funny names. Finally, in the Upper Paleolithic we only find Homo sapiens at archaeological sites. The lithic, the stone traditions are developing, they're becoming diversified. What's interesting is that the climate went through 3 phases before reaching its present condition: a relatively dry phase, a humid phase, and then a very dry phase, eventually culminating at 13,000 years before present in the present conditions of where we are today. Now, just as a side note, if we kind of step back for a second, we can see the climate, how the climate is in these Stone Age cultures is fluctuating terribly. There must have been some sort of big problem that occurred. I wonder what that problem could be, and I don't know, maybe like a giant flood or something. But if a giant flood occurred, we would have these terrible fluctuations in the climate. Now, of course, these fluctuations in evolutionary thinking extend back 1 million years, 1.5 million years. We are relatively young at our 13,000 years before present for our climate. Anyway, so we leave the Paleolithic and we kind of move into the Mesolithic. This is 18,000 to 8,500 years before present. During the Mesolithic, I didn't know that now. During the Mesolithic period, we find people living in caves. They built round huts. These are probably seasonal dwellings, different camps, according to Yonker. Burials reflect a greater concern with and interest in the dead. The bodies are now being interned into the house floors, buried in groups in a cemetery near the dwellings. We find grave goods, like one woman was buried with her dog, pet dog maybe. Stone tools include things like sickles. We find human and animal figurines made of stone and other materials. The post-glacial climate is still uncertain until 10,000 BC, and people seem to stay on the move throughout the year looking for habitats where they can survive. We've got this, it's cold, we're moving around, and it's finding a good place to stay. Eventually, people are going to start settling down in base camps where they find plants they can exploit. This will lead to agriculture in the next period, the Neolithic period. So if you're following already, you see this idea of, I don't know where we can rest. I have no place to rest my head. We've got to be on the move. And we have these different cultures moving around, different base camps here and there, burying their dead here, living here for short periods of time, and they're constantly on the move. This is where am I looking for? The Ice Age. You know, the times of the Ice Ages and those sorts of things. We finally reached the Neolithic. Neolithic, the new Stone Age. And Neolithic is 8,300 to 3750 BC. This we divide into 2 different periods: the pre-pottery Neolithic and the pottery Neolithic. And this is where it becomes even more confusing. The pottery Neolithic runs from about 6,000 to 3750 BC, bringing us closer to the time we want. And the key that marks this period of pre-pottery, the pottery Neolithic, is we begin to, we have a sudden explosion of sedentarism. People are finally settling down. Everywhere, just boom, explosion, hey, let's live here. And we find agriculture. It's here that we begin to find tell sites, the big round mounds, and people will begin to build up and stay in one place, probably because we have a real stabilization finally in the environment. These 2 phenomena also led to the rapid evolution, if you forgive the word, of social structures culminating in different cities, regional states throughout the Middle East by the Chalcolithic and the early Bronze Ages. We eventually reach into the Chalcolithic. I'm going to skip over that. Obviously, we have some problems with the Stone Ages. And we can begin to at least get an idea, again, of this post-flood era. We're going to place this all in post-flood era. We have Noah, the family. They begin to spread out. They have no place to lay their head. They're moving around. You have all these different sites. Possibly a progression of events. Who knows? But definitely not the 1.5 million years. Now let's talk a little bit about some problems in dating. I kind of ran through that quickly, forgive me. As I've already said, I disagree with those datings, those dates. First, the biblical text doesn't allow for those long periods. Even if it were possible to stretch the chronogenealogies of Genesis 5 and 11, as we were talking about back, we still wouldn't cover that 1.5 million years. Concerning the lower Paleolithic, that huge stretch from 1.5 million to, what was it, 100,000 years? It's a long time. Concerning the lower Paleolithic, Martin Harris says, the greatest enigma of the lower Paleolithic is why it lasted so long and why so little change took place over such a vast stretch of time, involving so many tens of thousands of generations of hominid beings. This is a problem for the evolutionary model. Tens of thousands of generations. Yeah, the climate was changing, but come on, tens of thousands of generations. Just I ran through the figures real quick, and if we were to, what did I do? I think I did like 3 generations for like 100 years or something like that. Just from today backwards to 3000 BC, how many generations do you think? From today back to 3000 BC, 150 generations. Lower Paleolithic has tens of thousands of generations. Now imagine how far we've progressed from 3000 BC till today. We've kind of did a little bit of stuff. We now use cups. We've got our computers that we don't know how to use because we're so stupid. But tens of thousands of generations and no change in a Paleolithic.
Monkeys.
Yeah. Well, probably this is. I think there's a problem with the 1.5 million down to 100,000 years before present. I don't think we need to stretch it out that far, and that's the point. Speaking of the change from Neanderthal to anatomically modern Homo sapien, these guys, Brose and Wolpoff, they argue that radiocarbon dates for the period of evolution are neither extensive nor exceptionally accurate. And then they go on to use the phrases subject to doubt and some question concerning the validity of. It's wonderful when you read these things. They say, oh, it's somewhere around, something like this is how we would translate this into modern colloquial language, right? It's kind of like this. But that's not very scientific. The point being that we have some serious problems with the dating methods. Now, these guys, Brose and Wolpoff, they do argue for the long ages. They just say we've got to set aside the radiocarbon and we've got to just go with the old-fashioned layers, and we're just going to pick them through that way. Because my layer says here, and I put this on my chart, and radiocarbon says this, and they don't add up, so I'm going to throw out one and just keep the other. I guess that's one way to do it. In his work, Archaeology in the Land of the Bible, Mazar, he explains that the Neolithic period is divided into 4 groups based on uncalibrated carbon-14 readings. The idea that we have to calibrate these carbon-14 readings. We have the carbon-14, and then we have to calibrate it according to our charts and say, okay, we got to work it now. Because the idea is, when you use carbon-14 dating in an uncalibrated method, you have to assume that the carbon-14, carbon-12 ratio was exactly the same as it is today. We have to make those assumptions because we have no way of figuring it out. We can go back and radiocarbon date those things, but then we have to use assumptions to assume that it doesn't work out very well. Now that said, radiocarbon dating is very accurate. It's accurate up to 3000 BC. But after that, after we leave the historical era and into prehistory...
No, go ahead. Maybe a really stupid question, but is radioisotope dating the same thing as what you're talking about?
I'm talking like normal carbon-14, C14.
Because I don't know anything about it, but I've heard that word. That's something that's used too.
Yeah. Well, there are all kinds of different dating methods. I'm actually not even sure if is it the same? Do you know? Radioisotope?
Well, it's the same principle. That you have a breakdown in the electron of whatever the element is. So in the case of carbon-14, you've got a breakdown where it goes from a more unstable state to a stable state. What you're generally probably talking about, radioisotope stuff, is the stuff that gives you the long ages, like the billion years, the argon dating and that kind of thing. But it's the same idea. is that the element is moving from an unstable condition to a more stable one, and it loses. I think it throws off an electron or a part of its the way that it is into a more stable state. So when you say radioisotope dating, you could put carbon-14 into that general category.
Okay, so that's like a generalization.
I would say usually, when they talk about carbon-14 dating, though, the difference is that carbon-14, you can only get a theoretical date of maybe 60 to 70,000 years. And then anything past that, the amount of carbon-14 is undetectable. Those other methods, which are usually called radioisotope, give you the big long ages when they do rocks and things like that.
But carbon-14 is what's mostly used?
When it relates to archaeology, yeah, because the other stuff is supposedly before life existed at all, or before humans existed, so it pertains to that.
The radiocarbon.
Yeah, that clears it up a little bit. Thanks.
Radiocarbon deals only with life specifically. Okay. You have, as we live in the atmosphere, you take in carbon-14, carbon-12, and then as we die, the carbon-12 stays the same, the carbon-14 leaves out of our system. And so the idea is we can now measure the amount, the difference, and come up with an age. I hope I'm saying that right. Anyway, the idea is carbon-14, we have to work with uncalibrated, so we have to calibrate it. We have to make sure we get it right. Kaiser says that prior to the Neolithic age, our knowledge, understanding, and dating procedures are sketchy, is the word he uses. An excellent example of this dating problem comes from the site of Jericho. The date for Jericho has been pushed back to 8500, 7500 BC, and this is based on the amounts of layers we have, the accumulation of layers. We have 26 occupational layers represented in pre-pottery Neolithic B. Remember all that weird stuff here? And then we have 25 occupational layers in pre-pottery Neolithic A. I'm just going to take one of those, pre-pottery Neolithic B. There's 26 layers, and show you how we have two totally different systems. In pre-pottery Neolithic B, the 26 layers, it's dated at a time span of about 1,500 years. So we have this 1,500 years pre-pottery Neolithic B, 26 layers, 26 occupational layers. It measures up to about 13 feet, 13 feet of accumulation over according to Kathleen Kenyon, a length of time is what she said. So she kind of guessed at this 1,500 year period. So the idea, Jericho, 26 occupational layers of pre-pottery Neolithic B, so 1,500 years to accumulate about 13 feet. Let me point out that there is nothing inherent in the number of occupational levels or the amount of debris buildup that actually gives us that amount of 1,500 years. Nothing requires that amount of years. Occupational levels, whether they're floors, courtyards, streets, whatever, they can last any amount of time, according to Randall Yonker again. He gives the idea from several years to even a year or less. You can have an occupational level. And then, again, Yonker points over to across the Jordan at Deir Allah, and he is looking at here. It's a different time period, yeah, but it's the same kind of concept. It's right in the area of Jericho, right there in the Jordan Valley. And what he has 40 deposits, and they run continuously throughout the area. And up to, we have 40 deposits up to 3 meters. 3 meters of accumulation, roughly the same size, right, as the other one. But what we have here is the dating is actually, it's not 1,500 years. It's, you want to take a guess? Take a wild guess. It's going to be lower.
Not 1,500, it's going to be lower than 1,500?
Yeah, it's going to be lower than 1,500.
250 years?
Close. It's 40 years. So what we have at Deir Allah is we have like 40 years for more levels, just about the same amount of accumulation. As opposed to over here at Jericho, we have 1,500 years for 26 levels, just about the same amount of accumulation. The difference is Kenyon kind of guessed at it, and this guy kind of used a pottery sequence, actually radiocarbon dating to confirm the pottery sequence, and it came up to about 40 years. So already we're moving this. If we just transferred this over to Jericho and said, well, the same kind of system, you can already drop the years drastically. But then we can even go on beyond that. I kind of fudged. I messed up on that. It's 130 years, but we drop it down to 40. It totally ruined the fun. I'm sorry. 130 years is what the pottery chronology confirms with the radiocarbon dating. But the idea that one guy, Franken, said, Franken was talking about how what we can do is when you imagine the rainy season, according to, let's jump back to Jericho real quick, Neolithic period. According to Mazar, we've got this strange rainy season. More rain than we've ever had in the area, really rainy. What we find back over here at Deir Allah is that during the rainy seasons, they're using mud bricks, and every time it rains, it starts washing away the mud off the mud brick, and it starts filling up the streets outside, and the streets are full of mud. It gets so bad that eventually the roads outside are going up past the houses. And so they have to start putting bricks in there to keep the mud from coming in. And we find a few houses, a few floors where the mud actually spilled over. So what do they have to do? They have to build up their floor and raise the roof a little bit. And then boom, 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 boom. And what they find is with these rainy seasons, every single year, it just washes away this mud, building up these levels and this accumulation. So what Franken wants to do is he wants to say, I don't think it's 130 years. I'm going to bring it down to just 40. It's 40 layers, 40 years. Just shrink it way down. Now that's just one example, but I think we can do that kind of globally on a larger scale. The problem is we just assume the evolutionary concept. It takes a while. I mean, look, the Lower Paleolithic took 1.5 million down to 100,000, tens of thousands of generations. Obviously it takes a while. And we just kind of assume that's in play here. We can very easily shrink these things down. It's just a matter of going through site by site, place by place, and actually trying to do the math. Another idea here is that, according to Braidwood, he says, we're convinced that these factors cannot simply be lumped under a single word, such as he's talking about the Neolithic, or he's talking in general. He says, when we're talking about these big ideas, we can't lump these all under a single word like Neolithic or Paleolithic, because things don't run in a line like that. His idea is that we actually have this multilinear concept where, this may be a Neolithic site, but who says it's not happening at the same time as this Paleolithic site over here? Because remember, you have these people constantly on the move. They're constantly moving around over this long ages of time. They pick up, they move, they settle down, live a couple years, pick up, settle down. And so Braidwood's idea is that we have this multilinear approach. With this multilinear approach, here, I've got some here for you. In archaeology, we are still somewhat bound by late 19th century classifications such as Mesolithic and Neolithic for period terminology and so on. These tend to establish an image of quick and all-pervading change from one level to another. I think the evidence increasingly instructs us otherwise. The different levels of complexity, hunting camp, village, city, integrated with one another in their development. That the hunter, in effect, was always there. That in the early villages, the proportion of food which was actually produced by agriculture, or the proportion of other bands in the cultural spectrum that responded to the substance pattern, was not at all bounded by a clear horizon. So his idea is, it doesn't happen like this. We've always got hunters-gatherers. Or we've got hunters-gatherers today. I spoke earlier about the Umanmanda, these savage people, according to Herodotus. They probably weren't as savage as what Herodotus says they were, but we still have these types of people living up in the Zagros mountain range while the Assyrians are ruling the world. So we have these, we have to think in a multilinear fashion. We can lower the time scale down, think in a multilinear fashion, and we can begin to solve the problem. I don't have the solution for you here today, but there are lots of people out there who have attempted to correct these prehistoric time periods. I don't know if we're ever going to have an actual, this is the answer, but the fact that we have multiple possibilities means that the evolutionary scale isn't the only one out there. There's an article by A.J.M. Osgood, A Better Model for the Stone Age, in a Journal of Creation. And he kind of sets this out. He ends up going with the whole 2300 flood idea, and I don't think that's right. I'm stick with Henry and place it back to about 3000 BC, somewhere around there. But he still, the point is he attempts to shrink it all down, and he successfully manipulates and pushes things into place. Well, I don't think totally successfully, but it works. In the end, the point with all this wonderful Stone Age mumbo-jumbo is that it doesn't have to be the super old stuff. We have other options.